Hello everyone, welcome back. This is episode 4 in a series that shows you how to build a completely custom website professionally designed in NextJS, Payload CMS as the headless content management system, and TypeScript. And we're pretty far into it at this point. I think I've recorded about like 5 hours so far of the initial project setup, Payload CMS scaffolding, so all the collections, all the content types, all the data modeling. And we've gone through and we've designed and built the entire header, footer, and mega menu at this point. But we still have a good amount to go. But I am very happy to announce that this episode, we're going to actually complete everything. And we do have a lot to cover in this episode. We're going to be going through the layout building blocks completely and building the front end equivalent to the back end architectures that we've already designed and developed into Payload CMS. If you haven't met me or you don't know me before, my name is James. I am the founder of a digital design studio called Trouble. And we did all the design work for this project, and it's a real world project that we've actually already released. And I'm also a founder of Payload CMS. And Payload is something that I am very, very excited about. Payload is a very, very modern headless content management system that's built in React and Node.js, and it's meant to be completely developer friendly. It's meant to give you the keys to build whatever you need and then step back and let you do whatever you want to do. And I think you're getting a little glimpse of my dog over there, maybe? Let's see, where do I go? Yeah, that's Blaster over there. He's a maniac. He's a puppy. He's about 1. Hopefully he doesn't bark or do anything crazy in this video. Fingers crossed. You'll probably see more of him. But yeah, this video is going to be a pretty exciting one. We're going to show you how to do some serious front-end work. We're going to get into Parallax. We're going to get into form submissions. We're going to wire up a custom form on the front end to be able to submit responses to our Payload CMS. And we're going to finish this thing. And all the code's going to be available for you on GitHub. And the Figma project I will also link in the description of this video. But before we get into the code, I want to take you through a couple things that are very exciting to me about Payload. It's been a very, very busy couple months for us. We've released our public roadmap. We've updated Payload with a ton of new features and functionalities. It's a really good time if you haven't tested it out yet to get your hands on it. But I'm going to share my screen and we will go through some pretty cool stuff. All right. Like I mentioned, the first big thing that I'd like to highlight from Payload really quickly is that we just released our public roadmap. And what that means is that we are publicly announcing all the features that we're planning on building into Payload over the next 2+ years. And we've got a lot of really cool stuff planned. We're taking feedback from the community on how we prioritize items and how we shape our roadmap in general. So if you don't see something on this roadmap that you'd like to see built into Payload, let us know. But it's on our website. If I tab over, here's our Payload website. All of these items here are organized by the quarter that we plan to release the feature or the function. And you can see that the public has the ability to upvote these features. If you're logged into our website, you can come and you can upvote these features. And then we will take those votes into account when we prioritize the workload. But we've got a lot of cool stuff. We're going to be building in complete revision history. We're going to be building an autosave. We're going to be building some new field types to make it so that you can completely customize the front end of your Payload admin dashboard. We're going to extend authentication. We're going to be building internationalization into the admin panel. We're going to be extending the rich type editor, or the rich text editor more extensively. And we are going to be potentially supporting more databases, all kinds of stuff. So if you'd like to influence this roadmap or if you want to have your opinion heard, you can visit our website, log in, and upvote these features, and we can go back and forth on what you'd like to see implemented. But outside of that, another cool thing that we've been working on is that we built in a feature to dynamically generate field and collection descriptions right in your admin panel. And this, if you look on the right-hand sidebar here, this little area, you know how like Yoast SEO, like WordPress plugins, etc., they have like a field and then like, for example, a meta title. It's going to validate the user's input as they type. So if they have too short of a title and maybe they're missing out on some keyword optimization for search engines, Yoast will actually show you, hey, this is too short. You should add some more stuff into there. Or if you go over the Google recommended limit, it's going to tell you, hey, your field or your page title is too long and you need to cut that down. And with this new feature of Payload, we can build that exact thing into Payload. So here's just a couple examples, like perfect length title, This is too short of a description. You need 29 more characters. These don't have to be dynamic. They can just be little helper descriptions, but we've got a full blog post written up about the potential here. Really cool feature. Check it out. And then the next thing I wanted to highlight really quickly is that Payload now has a complete plugins infrastructure, which is arguably the most exciting thing that we've done to Payload up till this point. And if you know how to write JavaScript, you can build a Payload plugin. One of the reasons why we built Payload the way we did is because I personally am extremely tired of using other people's headless CMSs that are just insanely convoluted and really difficult to learn. And they teach you their way of doing things. And it takes you a day just to get up to speed to write a plugin, let alone use the headless CMS. But writing a plugin, forget about it. You have to learn their hooks. You have to learn their architecture, their controllers, their data patterns and everything. And with Payload, it's so simple. And the proof is in the pudding, because we released that feature and immediately one of our community members came out with a very cool plugin that I'd like to highlight. This is to offload your media uploads to any third-party permanent storage. Could be CDN supported, could be anything. But this plugin, a member of our community, Richard Van Bergen, he wrote this and launched it, and it's beautiful. It can offload all of your uploads to Amazon S3, but you can also build your own adapter into this plugin and send your media to Cloudinary. You can send it to a DigitalOcean Space. You can do whatever you want, but the plugin itself is beautiful. You can take a look at this for an example, but it's also installable via Yarn or NPM just by adding Payload plugin cloud storage. Pretty cool. But we have some work to be done on the custom website. I'm just going to quickly go through what we're going to be doing in this video. This video is a little bit different than the format that we've done in the past, because as you can see, it doesn't look like there's much here with this little short, 5-item bullet list, but the heroes have to be built on the front end. The layout blocks have to be built. I think we have like 10 of them. And so we have a lot of React components to build. We're going to be extending the Payload rich text editor with some custom extensions to do some pretty fancy stuff that I'll highlight. We have a form submission infrastructure to build so that the front end of the website can accept form submissions from the public users and then store them permanently inside of Payload. And then we're going to be doing some really stylish stuff like adding a little bit of a background noise texture to the website, adding parallax, doing some animation stuff, page transitions, stuff like that. So we have 3 different heroes we're going to build. We have a minimal hero, we have a content above media, and then we have content left of media. We have layout blocks. Oh, there's more than that. How many do we have? I don't care. Call to action content. We go all the way through. We're going to build all of those in this episode. I'm going to go pretty fast, but all of this code is going to be available on GitHub for you. So I would highly recommend pulling this down and working with it yourself, because that's going to teach you more than anything. You can watch a YouTube video, but you really need to get your hands in code. And you can try to, code along with me, but I would spend some time with the repo and I would look at our code conventions and give us feedback. Whatever you see, if you have any questions on this tutorial, you should open up a GitHub discussion on either the custom website series repo itself or right on Payload, wherever you want. We'll respond to it and we'll take our time to tell you why we did things the way we did or help you through some of the decisions that we've made. One of the cool things that we're going to be doing that I haven't talked about much yet is that we're going to be extending the built-in Payload rich text editor with some custom extensions. The first one is going to be a red headline, and I'm going to show you that really quickly if I pop over to the Figma file. This is like a custom headline. And you might be wondering, like, how do you give admins the control over what they want to write and where it goes? So we're going to build that right into the rich text editor. And we also have this little underline component, this little red underline, and maybe we can do some animation for that. You're going to see that all through these mockups. If this is the first time you're seeing these mockups, if you're joining us now, you can find these, the Figma link in the description, like I mentioned, and you can also go back to that first video because I break this mockup apart in 30 different ways in that first video. But this is going to be a control right into the rich text editor as well. Should be pretty cool. And then finally, we're going to do form submissions. Mentioned that a couple times. We're going to build the contact page. We're going to make sure that our submissions are received properly on the back end, and we're going to store them. And then we're just going to be adding some stylish tweaks, some animations, some parallax, some page transitions, and this subtle background noise texture, which I think is going to be pretty cool. So let's get to work. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is a little recap. We're going to start from the ground up on the pages collection that we've already built. You can see here I've already got my local development environment up and running just by yarn dev, and then Payload will boot up and NextJS will also boot up right in the same node instance, which is super cool. But if I pop over and I log into the CMS real quick, I'm on localhost 3000 admin login. Let's go to pages, and in the first video, we actually already architected all of this out, but now you can see that we have some real content. We have a page here, and the content of this page is going to reflect this mockup right here. And how we build things at Trouble, when we build a website, we try to put all the control in the editor's hands. So we're not building templates, even though we have different pages here. Like if you look at this is a page, here's a page, here's a page, or here's studies archive, and then here's a contact page. These are not templates. These are not one-off pre-baked layouts. These are all just layout building blocks. You can mix and match them. You can reorder them. You can reorganize them, add them, remove them, whatever you want as an editor. And the content of this page reflects that. So the first thing we have, and the first thing we're going to be talking about here, are the hero types. As you can see by this radio field here, we have 3 different hero types: minimal, content above media, and content left of media. And then we have the hero content, and we have the hero media. Hero content, here you can see this is the first glimpse at our red headline. I don't have to use that red headline. I can type in here, I can say hello, and then I can set this to an H1 or whatever we want. But you can see that that is not styled red or uppercase. So how did we do that? The way that we did that was with a custom Payload rich text editor extension. So I'm going to show you those things first. You can see red headline and red underline here. They show up as extra items. We could create icons for that. Maybe we will at some point in the future, but for now we just rendered custom React just labels there. But how that works, if we pop over to our code, here's our page collection. Well, all this is a bunch of imports. You're going to have to hang with me. There's a lot going on in this file. We have a set of TypeScript types that correspond to the data that will be saved in this collection. And here's the payload config itself. This should be pretty familiar to you because we built this in the first episode. But I'm going to scroll down to this hero content. Here's my rich text editor field. Now this corresponds to this rich text editor field right here. And red headline and red underline are injected as custom leaves. Now, if you're not familiar with Payload's rich text editor, it's built on top of SlateJS, which is a really powerful editor built in React. And Payload allows you to customize that by injecting your own custom leaves and elements. Now, leaves and elements are a SlateJS concept. One of the things about Payload is that we don't want you to learn Payload. We want you to learn other things that are going to help you in your development career. So when you work with Payload, you're learning JavaScript. You're learning popular open source packages, and you're building what you need, how you need to build it. But here you can see I've injected 2 of these leaf components. If I command click on that, the shape of a custom leaf in Payload, you have to name it. You have to give it a button that shows up in the rich text editor, and then you have to give it a leaf that will actually be rendered inside of the editor itself. These 2 things are React components, and this is just obviously a string. But the button is what shows up here, and then the leaf is what shows up here and how you want it to be rendered for your users on the front end. So I'm going to take you quickly through those 2 things. They're pretty simple. If I click into button, all this is we're using the leaf button from Payload Components Rich Text to take care of a lot of that stuff for us. And we render that, we give it the name, our format, and then we just give it whatever we want. So I could say something different in here. I could render a custom SVG or whatever, but that's going to show up in the admin panel. And then I can go over to the leaf itself. If I go back to this file and I click on leaf. Now this leaf, all it does is just inject some inline styles directly on a span and then renders the children inside of it. So this is SlateJS again. You have to spread the attributes on every SlateJS leaf. That's a rule. And you have to then render the children inside of whatever element that you're rendering. Other than that, it's up to you. You can build whatever you want. You can have a button that's clickable that opens up a modal. You can do whatever. In this case, these are pretty simple, and they're powerful because they allow you to take that data on the front end and then translate it into your own React components. You map these leaves one-to-one with React components on the front end or wherever. I mean, it could be a mobile app. It doesn't matter. If I show you the shape of this data, if I click on the API URL down here, zoom in a couple thousand times here, close up the layout. Okay, here's our hero content. And you can see it's got children, it's got text, and then this is red headline true. So then on the front end, we're going to know to render this child as a red headline, as an H1. Pretty cool. React will allow us to do that, and you'll see that in a minute. Whoa, I just zoomed in further. Let's go back. And then we have hero media. One thing that might be different from the first couple episodes is that I went through and renamed all instances of the word image into media, because every place that you see an image throughout this entire site, we're actually going to allow an auto-playing, looping, muted MP4 style video right into our front end of our website. So this is an image in this mockup, but if our client wanted to render just a video for some texture about their team or their projects, they could just upload an MP4 and boom, it'll work on the front end. Super cool. So I did rename a couple things in this episode, but hang with me here and I'll show you some of that too. Now, what's also cool is that we have a condition on this field. So if you see this line here, maybe I can clean this up a little bit just so you can read it. Okay, so we have a condition which allows this media field only to be shown, only to be rendered in the admin panel if the hero type is equal to content above media or the hero type is equal to content left of media. Now, there's two arguments. The first argument is the full document, so you can access any other field's data in the whole document. And then sibling data only shows you the fields that are right next to your field in your architecture. And that's helpful because if you have like a super long array or maybe blocks in your config, and you have 10 blocks, but your condition is only dependent on one of those blocks, then you can use sibling data. Super cool. But what that does on the admin panel, if I go over here, you can see hero media is enabled right now. And if I click on minimal, it goes away because the minimal hero type, if I show you that, the minimal hero type does not have any media, so we don't need that field. So this is the minimal hero. Now compare that to the content above media, this hero. Those two things are different and they have different admin panel needs. But with conditions, you can render that information dynamically. And it's super powerful. A lot of content management systems are missing this. Even the big ones like Contentful, you can't do that. And it drives me crazy. You want to build a really, really nice editor for your admins so they don't get confused by all the functionality. And without that simple feature, admittedly, it's very, very difficult to build as a CMS developer myself. It's a very complicated feature, but it's very powerful as well. So with this type of condition, you can do some pretty powerful stuff. And then here's our layout. So I'm going to jump down to our actual NextJS page that's responsible for rendering these pages. This is in the /pages folder. And you can see what we do here. We've got a template, which renders out the things that are going to be needed in all pages. And then we have a page hero component. And then we have the render blocks component that's going to be responsible for outputting the layout. But the page hero is where we're going to focus on because I want to take you through how we've built these three heroes first. So this page hero component, we pass it a couple things. We pass it the title, we pass it the hero type, we pass it the content and the media, because the hero could take one of these. We might not need the media just yet, but we know it's going to need content, right? So if I command click into this page hero, you can see here's our props, here's our React prop, TypeScript. We don't use prop types anymore. I was just throwing it back to like 2017 or so, but now we use TypeScript. Here's our TypeScript types. We have a title, we have the type, which is a reusable type coming from our page collection. Content is unknown because it could be any number of JSON configurations. And then we have media, which is the media type collection. And here's what the component actually does. The component, the React component, takes those props. First of all, it evaluates the type. So if it's content above media, then we're going to render the content above media type. If it's content left of media, we're going to render that hero component. Or if it's minimal, we're going to render the minimal. And lastly, if for some reason our data is corrupt or something, and we don't have a hero type, then we're just going to render the rich text with the content. We also have this nice little component here, show after first render, which is going to simply hide the component until React mounts on the front end, and then it will enable. And because React useEffect will only run if you're in the browser. UseEffect does not run in a server-side rendered environment like how NextJS, obviously it's going to hydrate all of your content, it's going to send the HTML to your browser, and then it's going to mount everything. But this is a component that's usable to hide and then show certain items after they mount in the browser. So let's close that file. Let's go back over here and let's look at the simple one first. Let's go to the minimal template. So here we only need to pass it content and title. And again, this hero looks like this. So here's the page title, and then here's the content. Pretty simple. So how did we translate that in React? Okay. If you're hanging with us from the last episode, you'll know that we're using React JSS, which I'm never going to do again, to be honest. We preferred it for a while, but there are a lot of bugs with server-side rendering, specifically things with like media queries, and there's just some funny business there, and we're going back to CSS modules at Trouble. But this project is going to continue as we are going now with React JSS. First thing we're doing, we have a hook for use styles. We have classes. We're going to render a grid container. We're going to render the paragraph with the title, and then we're going to render a rich text component with the content. We're passing that through. Now before I go on, I'm going to go into this rich text and we're going to cover some things there. I don't know that we've spent too much time on this rich text component just yet, but it is a handy React component that we've written that translates the content from our API response right here. This is the SlateJS JSON output of this rich text editor. This React component is going to take this content and it's going to serialize it into React components that will output HTML. It's a lot of words. Basically, it converts JSON into HTML. And all we do here is we have the class for rich text, wrap it in a div. We go through and we give ourselves some styles that we know we're always going to need inside of our rich text editor. So we style the HR, we style the anchor links, we set a hover state on our anchor, and that's it. But we know that these anchor links inside of this rich text editor will now always be styled in this way. But the real magic of this component happens in the serialize function. So what we do is we just pass the serialize function our content, and inside of that serialize function, this is actually going to be pretty standard across all SlateJS to React conversions. A lot of this was pulled straight from their documentation, but the way that it works is you first evaluate if your node is a text node. And we bring that right in from Slate. So text is text node. Okay, then we're just going to render that text. If it's bold, we're going to wrap it with a strong tag. If it's a red headline, remember these are our two custom leaves. If it's a red headline, then we're going to render the red headline wrapping the text. Red underline, same thing. If it's code, same thing. Italic, same thing. You get the point. So these are the leaves. I'm going to come back to these two custom leaves in a second. But we have more than that. We have H1 through H6. We have paragraph. We have list. We have all kinds of other things. So if it's not a text node, and if there's still no node, then we switch on the node.type. So if I scroll back over here and I show you this node.type is an H1. So we're going to programmatically match up with a switch case what the type is, and we're going to render the HTML element that we'd like. Now this is where you can get fancy in React, because as you can see, we're just rendering an H1, H2, blah, blah, blah. And then we're rendering the children inside of it with a recursive call to serialize. But we could also render our own React components here. So let's say you had a fancy H1 component that did all kinds of stuff, like maybe some animation tactic, or maybe an animation to type in the characters as the user scrolls or something. I don't know. You could do that really easily. And that's why the Payload rich text editor is powerful, because it's not just HTML. If it was just HTML, then you'd have to parse that string and you'd have to do a lot of fancy stuff in React. But to be a true headless CMS, we don't even know if you're going to use HTML or not. So we don't want to save that in HTML. We want to save it in JSON and let you do what you need. Once you have this written one time, I don't care, you can copy and paste it from this repo. It's going to unlock your productivity as a developer. And it's going to make you understand what's happening behind the scenes, which is pretty cool. But now let's do some fun stuff. So let's go up to our red headline first. And this is our custom rich text editor leaf. If I command click into here, you can see that all it does is it just wraps with a span. Save that, give some semicolons. There we go. And we have a class. And if I go and I look at that class, it sets it to red and it uppercases it. And that's it. Pretty powerful. Very simple, but pretty powerful. Now let's do a more complicated one. I'm going to close some of my files. All right, red underline. This one is a little bit more fancy. And before I go through the code here, I'm going to show you why it's fancy by giving you a little preview of the actual live website. So this is the custom website here. And you can see here's our red headline. Whoop, I just refreshed. You can see a couple animations there. But if we scroll down, you can see that certain text elements like that right there, that's the red underline. And you can see that it animated in when it came on the screen and it drew that. First it converted the color to red and then it drew in the underlines dynamically, which is pretty cool. And that puts more emphasis on the copy, and that's an intentional design tactic that we used to really capture the user's attention. Obviously this is fake text, but well, you know what? If you're lucky, at the end of the video, I'll pull up the real website, and then you can see what we did with the copywriting and the imagery. But we need to do a lot of things to make this effect happen. So whereas this red headline component was pretty simple, all we did was just add inline styles. This red underline component has to know where it's at on the page, it has to know when it enters the viewport when the user scrolls, and then it has to animate in the underline and the color. So how did we do that? So the red underline component itself is kind of complex, but not really if you have a good understanding of the underlying principles. But the way that we're actually monitoring if the red underline is in the viewport is pretty cool, and it's a relatively new feature of browsers, but it is called Intersection Observer. And Intersection Observer has pretty good browser support nowadays. I think, can I use, let's see. Yeah, so it's not IE 11, but Edge supports it, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, everybody else does. And that means that it's good enough for me. We don't support IE 11 anymore, neither should you. Which means Intersection Observer is like our new best friend. And what that does is it allows you to monitor in a very performant way when an item comes into the viewport, how much it, like percentage-wise it is in the viewport, and many, many other things. So obviously we want it to happen when it comes in the viewport, and that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to skip these kind of boilerplates real quick. I'm going to go right to the component, and I'm going to talk about it. Here's the red underline component. First off, we have our styles that we pull in from React.js. We have a hook called useIntersect, which is great. It's a way to extract out a nice React API for the intersection observer. And that hook is going to be checked into this repo. It's really nice. You can use this if you'd like, but it takes care of all the hard parts about converting the intersection observer API into something that actually sends you back props or sends you back values out of a hook that you can use to re-render your component as necessary. So this does all that for you, and you pass it in your options for the intersection observer, and then it's going to send you back two things. It's going to send you back a way to set the node, and it's going to send you back the entry coming back from the intersection observer itself. So pretty cool. That's a topic for a different day. But all you can see here is we send it our intersection options. So we want it to be, here's our root margin, top, right, bottom is negative 25%, so it's going to pull it inward from the bottom of the screen. And then 0, or negative, which pushes it out actually. So it's going to start before it hits the screen. And then here's our threshold. So it needs to be this ratio inside of the viewport before it is intersecting. So that hook actually takes care of all that for us. And again, that's to monitor when the element comes in and out of the screen. Then we have the animation state itself, which we have a reducer for. The reducer is here. It's pretty simple. This could be state, but we set it up as a reducer instead. And then we have the initial value, which is both animated word in and out are both false. But the actual magic happens in this effect here. So we have an animation timeout. We set this to equal to false in both case in any case. And then if it is intersecting, if we get our entry back from our intersection hook, if it is intersecting the screen, then we animate it in. Then we set a state, has animated true, and then we clear the timeout up here. But if it has animated and it's not intersecting, then we dispatch and we tell it animate out. If one of these is not true, then it just says, hey, you know what, these are both false. Reset its state. And then when we do a little cleanup of that effect, we just clear the timeout. The markup is really simple. All it is it's got a ref, which comes back from our intersection ref, from our hook. We have to apply that to the element that we want to be monitored for intersection. And then we have our class names. Now the CSS here is going to be a little bit complicated. It's nothing to be afraid of. We have our base styles. We set it equal to whatever the current color was. So if it was white, it's going to be equal to white. If it was black, it's going to be equal to black. We have a background image, which is used to create that stroke. Now the underline in the element itself actually turns out that's really hard to do in CSS. We basically followed a tutorial for that. I think the way that we would go at trouble is like, hey, we have this effect. We know we want to make it work. How do we do that? We're going to do a little bit of Googling. We're going to go to CodePen. We're going to evaluate the different ways we can do that. And then finally, we're going to try them out and see which one works. Now, in this case, we are using a linear gradient to fake a background or to fake an underline. It's going to be 6 pixels and it's going to be 100%. Now when we animate it in, we're going to move that background position and it's going to animate, so it's going to slide in. We're going to set a transition, and when we animate out, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to change that position to 0, 100. So you can see that it's basically animating the background position here. It starts, the background linear gradient position is 100, 100, which is not visible. When it animates in, we're going to move it halfway visible, and then when it moves out, we're going to move it out. And then we have some specific styles to reduce down the size of the underline. So it's 5 pixels here, it's 4 pixels there, 3 pixels, and then 4 pixels and 3 pixels again. We're just basically saying, like, if you put this underline on an H1, it needs to have a larger stroke. If you put it on an H2, it needs to be smaller. H3, same thing. And these are all going for medium breakpoints. You can take a look at this code more on your own pace, but overall it's pretty simple. We just have the state that keeps track of where the component is in its animation. We have the intersect hook, which allows us to monitor where it is on the screen in a nice performant way. And then we have the CSS. And all of that together creates a nice reusable component, which you can see here. It'll be a few places in this once we get down there. But other than that, that's the rich text editor. And we're going to go back up to the minimal hero type again. And that's really it. So to see this in action, I'm going to bring you back. We have the paragraph, we have the rich text, and it's all inside of a grid container. So what that correlates to, if I go to a page that has that right there, you can see here's our paragraph, and then here is our rich text. I could add more into that rich text editor if I wanted, but we are just rendering out, I believe this is an H2 at this point. So now let's go back to the content above media hero, this one. Again, inside of our page hero component, if the type is content above media, we're going to render the content above media component. And this component does a few more things. First thing that you're going to notice, it has our grid, which is a very powerful way to position things in a nice and consistent way. I think we talked about that a little bit in a prior episode. But the content above media hero type first sees that we render a grid container, we have the grid, and then we have the cell that positions it. Because the funny thing about this layout is that it's actually not full width. If we go back over to our mockup and we show you what it looks like with the grids on, you can see that it steps in one column and it does not extend all the way to the, well, these are fake. It should be right there. It does not extend all the way to the 12th column. Now they're real. There you go. So we're rendering that cell to restrict the width, and then we're just rendering a rich text. And then after that, we're rendering the media itself. And now this gutter component is going to be responsible for restricting the gutter space available to us. So right now we know that we need this set of, 7 base? Yeah, 7 baseline. We need that on the left and the right of this component, and a lot of our components need that. So we have that gutter component that's going to restrict the width available to us. We just pass it left and right, which enables the gutter on the left and right, and then we render our media component. So quickly I'm going to visit this gutter component. Why is this yelling? Ooh, that's not good. There we go. So the gutter, all it does is it says, hey, if they passed left as a prop, then render classes.left. If they passed right as a prop, then render classes.right. But the magic is in the CSS of this component. All it does is it uses some CSS variables that we've set to apply padding in a nice, concise way on both sides. And we've already gone over this component a little bit, but it's very nice, very handy, and you're going to see that used in a lot of places. So now we have media. The media component itself is pretty cool because it does a lot of stuff for us. It's going to take the media type from our original payload scaffolding. So if I go back and I show you that, if I go to collections and I go to media, we already have our nice TypeScript types for all of our collections. And the way that we've built this data model, if I go back over to the page and I show you the hero media, this is an upload field that is related to the media collection. So if I go over to our CMS and I show you the shape of the data, hero media is a relationship to another collection. And we know it always has this data shape. So the cool thing about the Payload REST API is that it automatically populated that relationship for us. If I say $depth equals 0, and I close this up, you can see that hero media is just an ID. That's all it is. That's all that the data gets saved in the database as with that relationship field. But if I say depth equals 1, then all of a sudden that media document gets populated fully for us, 1 level deep. You can say depth equals 2, and then if there were any relationships on the media, then it would populate further. This is all documented in our, let's see, if I hit slash and I type in depth, let's see. If you want to learn more about the depth parameter, you can go to our documentation and scroll to the depth section right here underneath concepts. Really cool though, and basically the gist of it is that your depth will automatically be populated in the REST API and the local API with that depth parameter. The default value is 2, but if you didn't want that, you could set it to 0 and turn it off. But the thing that I was getting at is that we know that the TypeScript types need to be equal to that hero media, the media type. So if I go back over to our media type, we have a file name, we have alt, we have the MIME type, and then we have the sizes, which are each equal to the size details. And then from there, inside of TypeScript, we know very safely what types we're going to be passing to this media. And we're spreading the media type, which comes through beautifully. Now, inside of this media component, we have our types, which come from, we have our props, which come from the type. And we're extending it with these two extra props, class name to give it an optional class name, and then a preferred size to try to render that size image. And if it's not there, then we'll fall back and we'll render the default. But if it's a video, I mentioned this briefly, but everywhere in this site, wherever we have media, like right here, this could be a video or it could be an image. And eventually maybe our client might want to add some, maybe some B-roll footage from their office or maybe some field footage on the site, on a construction site or anything like that. They might want to add that into their website. And all they have to do is go into the CMS, remove this out, and then choose a video instead. We don't have any right now, so I'm going to close that and refresh. But if they did, and they will in the future, then they could just add it here. And our media component is going to take care of rendering the video for us, which is super cool, if the MIME type includes video. If it doesn't, we're just going to render an image. And we're going to dynamically choose the size of the preferred size, or we're just going to send it the file name itself. But really, the positioning and the magic all happens here with the gutter and with a quick class name right here. And we have a couple animations in the CSS as well. If I go back and I show you in the browser, if I refresh the page, scroll to the top, do that again, you see those fade in nicely and they fade up. And the way that's done is just all CSS. Nice and simple, with a couple different delays. If you have any questions on this stuff in specific, or if you want to know why we wrote the code this way, like I mentioned earlier, ask us in GitHub discussions. It would be great to have some in-depth conversations about this. But the last page hero is the content left of media. So I'm going to pop over to that one. It's going to be pretty similar to the content above media, except for the positioning is going to be a little bit different. And you can see we have a grid container for the content, but we also have just another div that's completely outside of this grid container for the media itself. And we're going to position this one absolute. So if I go back to the mockup, or better yet, I'll just go to a page with it, the Who We Are page. This is the content left of image. It should be allowed to overlap. And when you have an overlap in CSS, that typically means you have some pretty fancy positioning to do. And it's always going to be a struggle to get it to be done right. But in this case, what we did was we absolutely positioned the media on the right-hand side and just set it to 50% of the screen width. And then we just used our column system for this content here. Here's our column system. We only let it extend 10 columns to make sure that this content shouldn't overlap too much. It should only overlap just a little bit. But then we restrict that on mobile to 8 columns. And then we render the media. So the CSS for this one, we're going to have some animations again. We have the fade in up keyframes. We have the title, which takes the fade in up. We have the rich text, which takes the fade in up animation. And then we have the media. And like I mentioned, we have position absolute for the media. It's going to be positioned behind, and it's going to be 50% wide. And there you go. There's a nice kind of broken grid style layout. And that's how we render the heroes. So if I go back and I show you some other pages, we go to the Who We Are page. This one is content left of media. Notice that we still have the hero media and the hero content. If I go to our approach, we have the minimal hero, which only has hero content. And that's the heroes. Okay, so we've gone through the heroes, and that, as you might know, is just kind of referring to the first block on the page, just the one that does the most work. It has a big job to do, has to make an impression, has to engage the user. But from there on, we have our content blocks themselves, the layout of the page. And for this, we are using, to throw it back to the first episode, we are using the payload blocks field type, which is getting more and more powerful as the days go on. But if I show you what that looks like in the CMS side, we have a layout. Now these are all collapsed. One of the features that we just released for Payload is a user preferences API, which remembers your admin users as they interact with the admin panel itself. So like I collapsed these manually. I closed them up because I wanted to see them all at a glimpse, and I want Payload to remember that. Now, in the background, Payload will remember things like that about your admins, and you can actually use this API yourself with custom components if you want. We have a blog post written up about that. Check it out if it's interesting to you, but the moral is Payload is getting better and better, which I'm really pumped about. But if I refresh this page, you can see that these are still collapsed. But let's open some of them up and take a look. The content component is going to be a pretty heavy-hitting layout block. It's got background color, it's got columns. We've already scaffolded all this out. We've got a couple content right in a row. We've got a spacer. We've got more content. We've got a statistics block. We've got a spacer. I've named all these personally, so like I could say, here is the intro to page. And then this is just basically a helpful name to let your admins know what they're looking at. But you can name these whatever you want. They're not going to affect the front end at all. But keep scrolling. We've got statistics, we've got a spacer, we've got a media block, we've got a media content collage, more content, and then finally we have a study slider. So what that looks like on the front end, if I scroll down this page, we have the hero, then we have a content block, then we have more content left aligned with a little accent line, right aligned with an accent line, more content, this time it's on a blue background, and we've got a text red underline. And then we have the stat bubbles, which animate in nicely, and they have a little parallax to them as well. We have a full screen media block, which also has a little bit of parallax. Then we have this media content collage block that centers the content and allows you to upload media that surrounds it in a nice abstract way. Then we have another content block, and we have a study slider. And when I hover over this, you can see that a nice little cursor pops up and allows me to drag through the different slide or the different projects. Whoop, accidentally clicked it. My bad. Scroll back down to it. That was the last block on the page, I believe. Yep. And then the footer. So we're going to go through these blocks. We're going to do it in alphabetical order. The first one is the call to action block. So we've got one of those on the Who We Are page, I believe. Get a sneak peek here real quick. Sticky slider, our team, content grid, full screen image, an image slider, CTA grid, and then boom, here's the call to action headline block. It's pretty simple. All it is it intentionally bleeds off the left side of the screen. It lets the text wrap to however it needs. It goes to full screen. Whoa. Let's just shrink this down to like there. It goes to full screen on tablets, but it keeps that gutter on larger screens. So this is a pretty simple one. It's going to be a good one to start with. And if I pop over to the code, you can see that I have a call to action block being imported here. We've already scaffolded this out, so I'm just going to click in here quickly and refresh us on what's actually happening here. We're importing the background color field. We're importing the link field. We're giving ourselves a couple types that are reusable in TypeScript. And then we're defining the payload config for this block. The slug, the labels, the fields. First is background color, then we have content, then we have actions, which is an array. And what that looks like on the CMS side, if I go over to the Who We Are page, scroll down, find the call to action. Here's what that looks like. First, we have the background color. This one's set to orange. We have the content, and then we have the actions, which is an array of buttons, basically. It doesn't have to be a button. It's going to be rendered however we want on the front end. But this has one button in it. I could add another button if I wanted by clicking Add Action, and then I could say page or custom URL, but we don't want that. We only want one. So with this data, if I was to click on the API URL, I think I've gone through this a little bit in a prior video, but our layout is an array of blocks. And just like we did with the rich text editor, we basically loop through every block, and then depending on what type it is, we render a specific React component. And how that's handled, just as a quick refresher, in the page, well, the front end component in the pages folder, we have a render blocks component that takes that layout array, and for each one, it's going to map over it. It's going to choose the block from our components by the block type. So we have the block type, it's one of these strings that you can see, and it's going to dynamically select the appropriate block component and render that with all of its appropriate types. Otherwise, it's going to return null. Now, this is a really elegant way to do this because you just wire it up one time, you import your components, and then you just loop over them and then render them on the page. And React does that really beautifully for us. Now, that index for the blocks, already got this all set up here. We export a const components, and it's just an object where the keys are equal to the block type and the values are equal to the React component that corresponds. So if I click into call to action, you can see here are our 3 props. And all we do for the markup here, we have a wrapping div for the styles. We render the gutter. And we know that this gutter is only supposed to have the right padding. This is the background for the block right here. So if we look at the mockup, go over to the Who We Are page, scroll all the way down. Oh, no, our approach. I don't know what I'm doing. Here we are. Okay. So this is the component, this is the mockup, and it should have the right gutter, but it should not have the left gutter. Now this is a really tricky thing to do in CSS because you still want this stuff to line up to the grid, right? So if you have a container, you might think like, let's just put background color on the container. But if you had the container and then you rendered this inside of that, then you're going to be off because it's to center it, you can see that there's less space over here than there is over here. So it's actually going to be like over here. And it's not going to line up to your grid properly. So what we need to do is we need to do something in CSS to make sure that our content still lines up to our grid, but maybe we can like fake this background somehow by rendering it separately. So that's what this component is going to do. Notice that we have a gutter, and we use that gutter to position the background color. But then the grid container itself is completely outside of that background. That's because we don't want this background to influence the position of its contents. So example, if we go to the CSS, this gutter, you might have seen this already with our hero, the content left of media, we're going to position absolute. So let's clean, shall we? No. Here we go. Sorry, I'm losing it. The gutter itself is going to have background gutter, and there's going to be a background class. And what we're going to do with that, the whole block will be position relative, but the background gutter itself, that wrapper, will be position absolute. That will be z index 1, and the background will just be 100% of whatever's inside of it. And then the grid container itself will be position relative, z index 2, so it's just going to sit right on top of it. That's going to make it so that our background color does not influence the layout of the grid itself. This is a really common design tactic that we do at Trouble to try to break certain elements from the grid and allow others to stay aligned to the grid. And that's how we do it. So the gutter, we've already talked about that. The background color is a new component that we have not looked at yet. And it's a powerful one, and it's an elegant one, because if you've looked at the mockups, by now you see that we have some pretty commonly used background color components that are pretty much ubiquitous to the design of the site. And they all need to be typed safely. They all need to be responsible for rendering the color. It's basically like a mainstay of the design. And so this background color component is going to take care of that for us. If I command click in here, markup wise, it's really simple. All it does is it takes the color from the prop, and then it says, hey, let's go take the color from the classes dynamically. And all the magic really happens in the CSS. So if it's a blue, then we have a background color of blue. We don't have any global styles for blue. If it's red, we take the background color from the CSS variables. And then we say for everything inside of it, let's color that as an antique color. So that's a global React JSS selector for everything. And we're saying, hey, if you're inside of a red background color, then you should be antique yourself. Do all of that for the same way. And so it's a really simple component, but it's powerful because we know that we have to write it one time and then we can use it everywhere we want. In this case, we're just going to be position absolute and giving ourselves that background color. Now, the catch is sometimes we need to fake it because this is the actual aesthetically appearing color, but we want our rich text to be reliant on those background colors as well. To color themselves, because the admin can go and they could change the color of that call to action block to a blue, or let's say to a red, which would then make it so that the content inside of it needs to be colored as antique like we saw. So we're actually using, in the background, we're using two different background color components. We have the one that spans this whole width and it sits in the background just like right there. But then we have another one that just sits directly on top of it and lines up perfectly to the grid. And because they're the same color, you can never know the difference. So if I go into this inspector and I inspect this real quick, my computer is dying right now. We can zoom for you. All right, there we go. We've got an orange container right here. That background is actually orange, but you just would never know it because it's sitting on top of an orange component. But we also have the full background color back here, which is also orange. So little things like that as web developers we can get away with that make our lives a lot easier. Even though that's not the cleanest markup because there's an extra div there, the amount of time that saves you as a developer is just totally worth it. So I have no hard feelings about that at all. But then we reuse our rich text and we just pass it the component or the content. And then for the actions, we have a list of actions. You can have one or you can have two. And what that looks like is an array. It's a payload array field type. And then for each action, you have a link. And that link itself has the type, the URL, and the label. And now this is the first time that we're actually seeing this link component. Oh no, I think we've seen that in a video past. I'm getting all mixed up. But the link component is also nice because we can just render out the props. This all comes right through from our initial typing. And then we render the button inside of it because we know inside of this call to action, we want it to be a button. Other places we want this link to just render the link data, like if it's a page link or if it's an external link. Remember, we have set this content up so that if you want to link to a page, you get a nice drop down with page links. That way, if you ever update the URL for one of these pages, you don't have to go back through your whole CMS and change that. Or if it's a custom URL, then we just type that in. The data, again, looks like this. So that component is going to handle the actual linking, but the visuals will be rendered as with a button by ourselves. And that link component, remember, it's also used in the menu, it's used in the footer. These are all that same link component. All that's responsible for is linking where you're trying to go, but then the buttons themselves are rendered with a button component. So I'm going to show you both of those. First, we're going to go to let's go to the link itself. Here, it's the CMS link. It takes a class name and then the link type from the field, which is either a page or custom type, a label, and then an optional page, optional URL. First thing we're going to do, we're going to determine if that's a relative URL. If it's a relative URL, meaning we're linking straight to ourselves, our own website, or if it's a type of page, we know that we can use the NextJS link. So we've imported that from NextLink. Otherwise, we just return an anchor link and we let it link to wherever it was going to. So this has nothing to do with styles at all. There's not even a style sheet for this. It just renders out whatever you tell it to. And in this case, we're rendering a button. And the button takes a color, it takes a class name, it takes a label, and then you can override CSS by passing it in some CSS from the styles come from React JSS. And all that does is renders a semantically correct button HTML component element. And that's it. That's the call to action. Okay, so the next block we're going to be looking at is the content block, and remember this is a pretty heavy hitting block. It's used all over the place. If we take a quick scroll through the home page, bam, there's a content block. Here's a content block with a red accent or with an accent line and a red background. Here's another content block with an accent line right aligned with a red background. Then we have a spacer, and then we have more content blocks with the red underline. They're just used everywhere. So this block is going to be crucial that we build right in a nice, powerful way, but also unbreakable and highly flexible. So it's a tall order. But remember from our first video that we've already defined the content model for this block, and it's going to have a background color. It's going to have an array of columns. Each column you're going to be able to set its width, 1/3, half, 2/3, full width. Its alignment, so if it's left, center, or right aligned. You're going to be able to write the content for the block itself. And with SlateJS, we are passing it in our red underline leaf once again, but we're restricting the elements that are allowed to be used inside of this content block. And the reason that we're doing that is because notice that we do not have the H1 here. The H1 should be in the hero of the page. And for SEO reasons, you should never have more than an H1 on any given page. So we are omitting the H1 from this rich text field. And we're also injecting a custom element. So the first time around we showed the red underline and the red headline. Those are two custom SlateJS leaves. But right here, this is a custom element. And the difference between an element and a leaf inside of SlateJS, you can check out their documentation for something more accurate than what I'm going to say, but I believe elements are used when you can potentially have more than one element inside of another element. Alternatively, a leaf could be thought of as like the lowest common denominator that just contains a document's text. It just renders text. And so things like bold, strike through, maybe like italicized, those are leaves, but elements would be more like a block level HTML element. And so an HR would be an element, not a leaf. If we click into this, it's going to be very, very similar to the leaves that we've already looked at, but this one does have a plugin. And how it's going to be rendered on the dashboard, if I show you that real quick, let's see if I can find one. Would it be in the home page? Maybe it would be in the proof points. Nope, next one. There we go. There's an HR. And it's rendered like an M dash inside of the toolbar itself. Now, this is not editable. You can see that I try to click on it, but it puts my cursor above and below it. And for that, we need to have a plugin. So the button is the same thing. If we click into there and we show you what the button looks like, well, let's just fix some of these errors real quick. The reason that those are errors is because Payload is in the same NPM project as our admin panel here, and we want to rely on the Slate dependencies from Payload, and that's a restriction from Slate. So I just ignored that ESLint rule really quickly, but we have a way to insert the button, which is a function. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, this HR doesn't have any text, so we'll just put in a space. And here is the shape of the data for an HR. And all it is just type HR. Then we have the nodes itself. So we are going to be inserting the button, and then we're going to be inserting a space after the button. The nodes are what's actually going to be injected into SlateJS. So when I click on this insert button, or when I call this function, it's going to insert not only one node for the button itself, but it's going to insert two. You know what? This should be called HR. Yeah. This is outdated, actually. Not for long. Okay, there we go. Hang with me for a minute while I get my brain straight. Okay, so here's the nodes that are going to be injected. Blur selection is a handy, basically a nice to have, so that when someone clicks on that HR button and injects an HR into the Slate editor, like if I click down here and then I say that, we don't lose our focus. You see that my cursor has reappeared where it was in the first place. Now that is because we remembered the blur selection location. Now, I'm going to be honest, SlateJS does have a learning curve of its own, but that comes straight from their documentation. That's not really a payload thing. So what we do is we store the blur selection, and then we can replace the blur selection after we insert the HR by just offsetting +1. So if you ever need to look at that, I would suggest just looking at this repo. It's a really nice thing for your editors if you're adding something that's like not clickable. But what we have here is we have an element button, which comes from Payload. And we are rendering just an M dash here. And we're giving it the format. And then when it gets clicked, we're going to be calling this function. And that's all there is to the element, or to the button. Now the element is much simpler, as you can expect. It's just going to be an HR. You do have to render children no matter what with Slate. It's a background thing, so you can see that all Slate elements take children as a prop, and you do need to spread the attributes, and you need to pass the children through, but then you just render whatever you want. So I just rendered an HR there. Now, the one thing that we haven't looked at already for SlateJS extensions is the plugins. Now, plugins are SlateJS concepts that you can extend Slate functionality. So it's pretty simple. You take an editor and you return an editor. Let's just turn this off as well. You take an editor in, you extend the editor, and then you return the editor. And in this case, we are modifying the isVoid function. We're taking in an element, and if it's an HR, then we say this is a void element, which means that you're not able to click into it, you're not able to type into it. All it does is just add something into your editor. Whereas like an H1, if you add an H1 element, then that element you can type inside of it. But an HR, you cannot type inside of it. You just want it to add itself. So if it's an HR, you return true. Otherwise, you return the isVoid element itself, which comes from the editor. So that's basically a simple plugin, and we are using that. We're injecting that into our HR custom element here. So moving on, we just covered a little bit of crazy stuff with this SlateJS editor here, but we're moving on. We have another checkbox for accent line that will be either enabled or disabled, and that accent line will correspond to the, well, let me refresh this before I break anything. The accent line will correspond to this little guy that bleeds off the left and the right of the page. Just a straight up checkbox. But then we have the alignment. We need to know if that alignment for that accent line is going to come off the left or the right side of the page. And we have a condition that only shows this field when accent line is checked. So we've talked about that a little bit in a prior part of this video, but if I pop over and I look at what that looks like, you can look at this answer. Accent line is enabled, so we have the alignment. If I turn that off, that field goes away. And then finally, the last two fields we have are padding. And we've already scaffolded out the data for this, but we will talk about the React component shortly. Padding is going to be a reusable concept, and you can choose between none, small, medium, and large for bottom and top. What that's going to do is it's going to allow the admin to make very fine-grained decisions about how much spacing they want between each of their blocks. The reason that it's padding and not margin is because we're going to do some pretty fancy stuff with background colors. Like technically, if I was to pull up my inspector, this little faked big red block here is actually multiple content blocks. It's just faked because there's no space between them. So if I show you this, here's content block number 1, and here's content block number 2. And this content block has small spacing above, or padding, but large below. And this one has large above, but small below. And there is no margin, which allows us to fake this whole layout. If you look at this, you can see it all looks like one block, but those are definitely separate things. We have the question, and then we have the answer. Then we have a spacer, then we have another content block here, 2-column content here, and then we have another content block here with 0 space between. And so what that looks like, if I scroll up here, remember that question and answer. Here's our question block set to the background color of red, and here's our answer block also set to the background color of red. but it looks like they're the same because there's no space between them. It's a pretty nice way that we did this, and it's going to be really stable for the admin to use, as well as highly flexible. So that's the markup, or that's the config, and now here's the React component. So as we saw, we have columns, and the columns are going to correspond and use our CSS grid columns. So we have some styles, and these are going to be usable. We're going to be able to automatically access these properties and then render the settings for the columns dynamically. And then here's our component itself. It's just called content. We have padding top and bottom. We have the accent line and its alignment. We have the columns, and then we have the background color. Everything will always be in a gutter, and the gutter will be turned on left and right. So what that means is if there's a background, great, then that background will be nicely positioned with that color. Similarly to how we did it for the content or the call to action block. But if there is no background color, great. It's still going to be there. There's still going to be a gutter in the background, but you're just not going to see it or need it. So we have the gutter. We have the background color, which we're passing through. We have the padding, which is a new component. So if I click into this, you can see I'm just threading those two props through. But if I click into this padding component, it's nice and easy. All it does is just renders two classes, and it uses the padding size. So if I hover over this, you can see small, none, medium, large, and just automatically chooses classes, adjusts those classes automatically for media queries, and does it all in one place so that we can reuse this component in 1,000 places. But all it is right there, just render it, and you're done. Now the beautiful part about this gutter and this background color that's different than the call to action block is that this one is equally placed in the center of the screen. So the left and the right gutter, we can just plop our grid immediately in the middle of it. Whereas if we go back to the call to action over here, remember we had to absolutely position this one because otherwise it would throw off the centering of our component because we only have the right gutter. In this file, we have left and right, which means that we can place our content right inside of it and everybody will be happy. So we've got our grid container. We've got our accent line, which dynamically selects, number one, if accent line is true, it will render. If it's false, it won't render. But it's going to dynamically choose its alignment. And then we have the grid itself. So all we do here is we map over the columns. We choose the column styles based on the width of the column. And then we say, you know what, on mobile, everybody's going to be columns 8. And then we render our content. So at this point, you can see a lot of different React components coming together and making our job easier. We did a lot of boilerplate up till this point, but this is a very complex component. But you can see that we have all of our concerns nicely isolated and compartmentalized. So we're bringing them all into this one file, and now it's like a concert with everybody playing together. But it took us a minute to get here. But from the rest of these components, it's going to be a very, very similar process. If we look over at the CSS, there's probably not too much going on here. First thing, we need to overflow hidden on the content. Then we set up our alignment. And mostly it's just center and right. Pretty straightforward there. The grid container is position relative. Then we style our accent line and position them accordingly. Those accent lines are absolutely positioned, and they're going to be falling off the right or the left side of the page. Now, these accent lines are why we had to say overflow hidden on this block, because we're actually faking it. You can see that the width 100 view width here, that is actually going to make it so that in reality, our overflows are way off the side of the screen. They're like way over here because they're 100% of the view width. And that would create a horizontal scroll. So what we did was we just said overflow hidden on the content block itself, which will prevent that overflow hidden and allow us to have these bleed off the side of the screen appropriately. But that is the content block. It's pretty powerful. It's like a concert, like I said, with all of the all the different components we've built thus far: padding, grid, container, gutter. It's using everything in a really nice way. Okay, so the next component in alphabetical order is the CTA grid. And that's what you're seeing on the screen here. It's basically just a vertical grid of all the different calls to action that a page might need. It's not necessarily for job positions like we have here. It could be for anything, but that's why we named it CTA grid, and we didn't call it like jobs grid or anything like that. We wanted it to be open-ended. And we already went through the data side of this component, and I'm not actually going to cover the way that this one was built just because it basically has everything that we've just done in the content block itself. But it has been built and checked into the repo. So if you did want to see how it was built or look at the code for it, you can scroll through the Who We Are page, get down to the bottom of this guy, past the slider, past all this other stuff, and take a look at it. It's pretty straightforward. I think you'll find it easy enough to wrap your head around if you just hung in there through the content block. But instead, we're going to go to the next component, which is the media component. Now the media component just takes, you guessed it, media, and then it styles it in either a normal, full screen, wide position. And this is a pretty straightforward component. The only thing that we're doing here is we are rendering some parallax, which is going to be the first time that you're seeing some parallax in this walkthrough thus far. Now this is the front end component. If we have media and it's an object, and if it's full screen, then we're going to render it inside of a parallax component. So you can see right here, this parallax component is new to this series. And all we do inside of it is we just render the media component. But the full screen type is the only one that supports parallax. You can see that it's missing from these other two. And the reason is because we have made this nice little effect where it kind of comes into the screen like it's actually like the container's not moving, but inside of the container we have overflow hidden and the photo kind of just parallaxes inside of its own little box there. And the parallax component itself, I'm going to click into that and we're going to talk about this. It takes a prop of y distance, which is the distance that something should parallax. And this component has been a mainstay. It's gone through a couple evolutions at Trouble. We use it once in a while if the project requires parallax, but it relies on a couple of our faceless UI dependencies to actually calculate how much parallax should be applied and when. So use window info. We can get the window height from there in a nice, concise way. You might be wondering, why don't we just get that from window.innerHeight? That's because this way it's a React prop. In this way, it will force a re-render of our component. Whereas if you're just reading it off of window.innerHeight, then your component's not going to re-render. And we also have use scroll info. So we have scrollinfo.y. That's going to say how far the user has scrolled through the document. And with the window height and with the scroll y position, we can do some fun stuff. So basically, this is the magic of the component right here. And it's all based on a node ref that we've rendered on our actual HTML element here. So HTML element comes from it's just basically a prop that allows you to specify if you want a div or a paragraph or an li or anything like that. And we're going to add that ref directly to this HTML element. And we're just going to give ourselves some class names, and then we're going to render some inline styles that are created dynamically above. Now that style comes from the translate y, which gets stored in state here. Initially it's going to be 0, but if we have a node, so this is only going to render after our component has mounted and our ref has registered itself, we're going to get the bounding client rectangle. That's going to give us information about where that div is on the screen, left position, top position, everything like that. Got a couple different variables set up to determine if the node is in above or below the viewport, because we only want to do this if the node is visible. That's a performance optimization. You don't care about where things are parallaxing if they're off the screen. Only if they're on the screen is when you want to actually calculate and re-render that new parallax value. So we're doing that inside of an if block, and all we're doing is we're saying, hey, where's that node Y position from the bounding client rectangle? Divide that by the window height, and then set it as a translate Y. So percent of window traveled, that is a decimal, but multiplied by the Y distance, that's how far you translate. And then down here, all we do is just translate 3D, and we translate it. Like I said, if you have any feedback on this component, or if you're interested with any other questions, let us know in the GitHub discussions. But this is being used in a nice and simple way in the full screen media component. This one is obviously going to be full screen. Then we have wide, which is going to set itself inside of a gutter with left and right. And then we have the grid, which obviously the wide is going to be quite a bit wider than the grid. If we go back to our mockups, I can show you the difference between the two. Let's see. Here is a media component nested within the grid. And then I believe somewhere else, let's see. We might not have one displayed, but we also have a way to set it equal to the gutter, which would be basically the width of this red block here. Just to give the admins a little bit of flexibility when they're actually crafting their case studies or their pages. If they want to create a nice, compelling, visual heavy layout, they can do that all by themselves. And that's the media block. Okay, just went over media. The next few components are very similar, and they don't really have anything new besides this media stat collage, which we want to do the statistics block first before we talk about this component. So I'm actually going to skip that one for a minute. These three basically just rely on things that we've just learned, so parallax and media. If I click into one of these, you'll see what I mean. You can have an array of media, and all it does is renders it out in a nice collage that you can see in action down here, like that. That's just a nice collage component. And then we have the media grid, media content collage, which is on the home page. Here. Just kind of creates a nice collage effect with the centered content in the middle, with the background gutter, the background color, and then just has an array of media resource references. No real new principles there. Then we have the media grid, same thing. Used to create the team layout right here. Same thing, just a little bit of parallax and media and background color and gutter. And then finally, we have the media stat collage. Whoops, wrong way. The media stat collage, the reason I don't want to go over that one yet is because it's got these stat bubbles, and I want to talk about those first. So to keep in alphabetical order, we're going to do slider next. And the slider is actually a pretty different component from what we've reviewed thus far. The vanilla slider, this is the payload collection config, or the payload block config. It's got a background color, and then it's got slides. You need to have at least 3 slides and the max 9. And inside of there, it's just a media reference. So this is going to be, you could call it a media slider if you'd like, but what that's going to correspond to is this guy right here, where you're going to get that nice little drag handle, and you're going to get a little slider progress bar, and then you're just going to have media that slides in and off of the page with the background color. So if we go over to the component for this, well, let's actually go look at it in the browser first. I think we have one on the Who We Are page. Let's see. Oh, right here. Yep, there we go. So we got the drag me slider, and then you can just simply drag through. The cool part about this component is that, like everything else, it fully supports video in any one of these spots. So you could create like a really interesting, like this one could be moving. And that would really provoke the user to scroll through these. And so when we get to the live project here, I'm looking forward to adding a lot of video. But the component itself, we pop over to the code. We have a couple new concepts. First, the grid container width. Now this is something that we have not talked about yet, but it's kind of cool, and I want to walk you through that first. So the grid container, as we remember, is just responsible for setting up the left and right alignment, margin left auto, margin right auto, putting padding for mobile purposes, and then a max width so that our grid can always have the same width no matter where it's rendered on the page. Now, one complex part of that, if I go over to the mockups, there are times where this width is exactly equal to what you told it to be because you have a max width. But if your screen is smaller than that, then it's going to be max width to the screen, and it's going to have any number of sizes, and you're never going to know how wide that grid actually is. It's not going to be your max width. It could be less than that. So we need to have some way, some type of utility that gives us the actual width of the grid in pixels at whatever screen size that the user is currently looking at. So for example, what we've done is we've extended this grid container with a provider, a context provider. And what we're doing there is we're importing use window info to make it so that our component refreshes every time the window changes sizes. We're going to store that new width of this grid right here inside of local state. So we're just rendering a dummy grid container. And I believe this is at the bottom of our app.js. So if I scroll down there and I show you, we find it. Grid container width provider. So this provider wraps everything. And it's really cool because that way that provider itself is going to render a dummy component. And then it's going to measure that component. And then it's going to send that width down through the component tree so that anyone can use grid container width at any point and get that actual width that it needs. And that's going to allow us to do things like this, where this is bleeding off the right side of the page, but it's not bleeding off the left. So how do we do that? Well, we need to know the difference between the grid's width and the overall screen width. If we have the overall screen width and we have the grid's width, then we can get this value right here. And that's the whole thing. So we could say overall width minus grid width divided by 2 gives you this. And then we can position this slider accordingly. So that's a lot of front-end magic, but the concepts are fairly simple, but this provider is going to be what allows us to do that because this is keeping track of its own width and it's providing it down the tree with this hook. So if I go back into our slider block, you can see the first thing we're doing here is we're getting the grid container width. And in this case, the only place that that's used is we're only allowing the images within the slider to be the maximum width of the grid. And that's going to allow us to keep that alignment right there. But then we have this slider on background component. And the reason that this slider on background component isn't just written directly into this file is because the slider is actually used in 2 different places. It's used here, and it's also used in the study slider, which you can see on the home page. That's the same component. We want to abstract that out into a reusable component because a lot of the functionality is exactly the same. You can see we have this progress bar, and then we have the slides bleeding off the right-hand side of the screen. And we have all the functionality inside of it, like being able to free scroll. I'm not clicking and dragging. I'm on my trackpad to the left. But basically, I'm just swiping left and right like you would do on a phone, and it's just freely scrolling, just like I'm scrolling up and down. It's a nice little tactic that we built into this component. You can also click and drag if you want, but you don't need to. So going back over here, as you can see, the magic really happens in the slider on background component. So if I go in here, the slider itself is fairly complex. I'm not going to go too far into detail here because we have a lot to cover yet. But what we have to do is keep a couple different refs. We have to get the width of the window. we have to have the slider padding on the left, which is basically what we're going to be, what I talked about earlier. We're going to be setting up the slider left padding when the width changes of the window. We're going to be disabling the track if the slides are less than 2, because if the slides are less than 2, then you don't really need that track. We render out the background color, position absolute, just like we've done before, so it's completely outside of everything else. We have a slider provider. Then we render the slider inside of that with each slide. And the slides themselves come from the props. If we want to show the track, then we have a grid container, and then we render the track itself, which is basically just a percent scrolled times 100%. And so that's going to move as the user scrolls through the slider. Now the slider provider itself is got a different job to fill. We just looked at the, where am I right now? I lost myself. Components. Yep, okay. So the slider provider has a lot of things to pass through its context. And that's why we set it up like that, so that if there was some component inside of it that needed to have like a next or a previous arrow to click and advance the slides by one slide, then we can have this context, and any component inside can utilize the slider context and trigger these types of actions on the slider itself. And again, I don't want to go through this too much just because there's a lot to cover here, but if you do have any questions about this, take a look and we will help you there. While we're on the slider, let's just compare and contrast the two different places that it's used. So we have the media slider, which renders the slider on the background, and it puts out an image for each slide. But we also have the study slider, which also uses that slider, but instead of putting an image out, it's going to output a div with a link with an image inside of it. So that this image is actually going to be the preview of the study itself. Now we haven't talked about the studies yet too much, but it's going to choose the featured media from the study, and it's going to render the featured media as the image and then output the title below it. So this is basically a nice component. If I go to the home page, I scroll down and look down here. We've seen this a couple times, but the beauty of it is that all of this gets populated dynamically by the CMS. So if I go here, I refresh, go to the home page, scroll all the way down to the study slider, we're dynamically referencing studies that exist elsewhere. So we're not manually building that up. We're not saying, hey, use this image in this title, this image in this title. We're just referencing existing studies. So if I go over to studies, that's actually a relationship field that points to these studies and automatically populates all that information. So if I go to the home page, for example, real quick, this is who we are, our approach. We look at the last block. Right here. Studies is an array of dynamically populated studies. And that's really cool because that allows our admins to have an easier job when they craft this. And if they change the title of a study, then it would change here as well. But let's just do one more thing for the sake of demonstration. Remember that we have that depth parameter that I went over earlier in this video. The depth parameter is actually what's helping us with these studies because the studies are getting dynamically rendered as well. So if I close everything up here, what am I doing? Right here. Here's the studies. You can see they're dynamically populated. But if I do depth equals 0, then I scroll down to that last block again, they're just going to be IDs. So Payload takes care of that for us, which is really nice. But you can see how by isolating our concerns and reusing components wherever possible, it's going to be a lot easier for us in the long run, because if this slider has a bug in it, then if we fix it in the slider on background component, then it will fix itself in both cases where we've used it. So having that component-based mentality really helps out a lot. Okay, now for a quick one. We just went through some pretty heavy-hitting components, but this is the spacer component. And the spacer is a beautifully simple component. All it's meant to do is provide extra space where you need it in the front end. So for example, we might have a spacer between these two blocks right there, just to create that empty space and allow these statistics bubbles to still overlap. The spacer is used here and there. It's also used here between two content blocks, but it's very, very simple and kind of nice and tidy. So we're going to quickly cover that one. The only field that it comes with is the size, but the component itself just renders a div, dynamically chooses the class based on the size, and then sets a height using these sizes. By the way, these sizes are also used in the padding component, which is pretty cool. So the spacer component is nice and simple, but they can't all be that simple. So let's go back to another complex one. Statistics. I've been kind of looking forward to this one a little bit in a weird way, but it has some complicated parts to it. It's not, I mean, the slider is 13 times more complex, but the statistics have some nice reusability and some weird CSS tactics. So first off, the actual payload block config isn't really that complex. You have background color, which is a reusable field. You have overlap, which is a new field that we haven't discussed yet. But the overlap is a reusable field that if I navigate down into my fields and I show it to you, it's basically just going to say small, medium, or large. That's it. And we have it abstracted so that we can rename it easily. So get overlap is going to output the top overlap, but get overlap down here is going to output a field with bottom overlap as the name and the label. So overlap is actually a row with two fields inside of it. They're the same, but they're abstracted. So here's the actual fields. And on the front end of the admin panel, what that actually looks like, if I scroll, let me close these up again. Here are the statistics. We have the top overlap and the bottom overlap. So because our configs are just JavaScript, we can do some nice stuff like that. And it's really nice and tidy. I actually don't need these labels at all. I can just delete those because we don't need it. Payload will automatically generate human-friendly labels based on the name of the field. So for example, top overlap will be turned into top overlap. Payload understands camel case, and it will automatically put spaces and automatically capitalize accordingly. So just to make our jobs a little easier, we don't have to write those out every time. Now, overlap is used in that stats block config. And the reason that that's used is because in our mockups, the stat blocks actually significantly overlap the things that they're around. Like in reality, if we didn't have that overlap field, these would start here. Well, down here actually, right? Because it wouldn't be overlapping this content block. And then this would start down here, probably like right there actually. But because we have that overlap field, that's going to allow us to use negative margins to place these stat blocks over surrounding content. And then finally, we have an array of the statistics themselves. And you'll see that the fields are actually going to be abstracted as well into a reusable field declaration because we have these stats here and we have it in the media stat collage. So these are used in multiple places. And it's just stat and description set inside of a row. So if we go look at what that looks like on the front end, we have a stat and a description. Stat, description, stat, description. You can move these around, you can remove them, you can add more, you can follow your heart. But this is the way the admin panel looks. And then in the browser, we have some parallax. Well, let me refresh because we have a couple more things. The first thing is that they fade in when they come into view like that. And the second thing is that they're slightly parallaxing. And so with the negative margins and the appearance on the introduction to the screen and the, whatever else I said, can't remember, it's a pretty dynamic block. Now let's go over to the component. Okay, here's our props, top, bottom, stats, background color. We're dynamically fetching these classes, which are kind of beautifully simple. Right here. Overlap small, overlap medium. We reduce them. We reduce them for mobile. We render the gutter, and the gutter is because we do have a background color for these stats. So we kind of faked it again by saying, like right here is actually where the content block stops, and right here is where the statistics block starts. So all this blue in the background actually comes from the stat blocks, but it looks like it's part of the block in front of it. So just like we joined up these existing blocks like these ones to make it seem like they're all in the same section with background color, we did a little web developer trick and we did the same thing with these stat blocks. So it looks like it's seamlessly joined up with this narrative here, but in reality, it's a whole separate layout building block. So you can get kind of creative. Like as you gain experience as a designer working on these projects and thinking in like a layout building mentality, you start to have a better and better grasp of what's going to be possible and what's going to give developers a huge headache. And in this case, we kind of had that and we knew like, you know what, this is a kind of a crazy layout, but you know, what if we just gave an overlap property? And then what if we just gave the background color? We could probably do it. And we did. So, stats, render out the background. We have that top overlap here again. You can see that here it's top overlap, but here it's background overlap. And that is because the background color needs to actually pay attention to the overlap settings. Otherwise, you're going to get blue over top of the components, right? Because we have a background here, but the background technically would cover this, right? So we need some padding. Let me show you that in the inspector real quick. Let's go look in the background color here. See that? It's got that bottom and that top to keep it away from the container above it. And this is going to be equal to the margin top, the negative margin top. So the component will pull itself up, but then the background will push itself down the equal amount. And then we just loop through the statistics themselves. We render out a parallax component. We set the distance 50 plus each iteration. So the first one will be 50, the second one will be 100, and the third one will be 150. That way we get a nice little effect that the bottom one is actually traveling the fastest. Those are not all parallaxing at the same speed. And my computer is dying because of this recording, but it's buttery smooth if you pull it up on your computer. The bottom one is actually moving the fastest. And then because this statistic is reused between this component and the media stat block, we have our own statistic component. And inside of here, this is a little bit more simple, but it does take track of where it renders and how it renders in on the first load and its sizing and everything like that. So what we do there is we have that use intersect hook once again. And we say when the threshold is 0.2, we're going to use the intersection observer to render or not render. And only render it if it's above the viewport and intersecting. So if you're above the viewport, if you scroll past, like if I go up and then down, it's going to remember that you were above the viewport, and it's going to stay there. And then we will use some simple, let's see, where am I? Simple CSS to size, and then animate the opacity of the block as of the statistic as it scrolls onto the screen. So you can see we're setting XXL, and then we're setting XL, and then we're setting medium. Pretty cool. And then that stat component is going to be used elsewhere, like I mentioned. React really helps us out nowadays. Like, I think back to the jQuery days, and I don't know how we ever did anything. I don't understand it. We would have some pretty cool stuff too, but like just the lack of reusability and the lack of a component-based mentality just scares me if I was still having to be a developer with jQuery. Okay, so the next block we're going to look at is the sticky content block. And this one's pretty cool. You might have seen a concept like this elsewhere online before. We didn't necessarily invent it, but we've used it to a pretty cool extent on this project. And what it is it's going to use position sticky from CSS. That's why it's called the sticky slider or the sticky content. And when I scroll down this page, you can see that the principal description on the right is free to scroll away. And when the new one comes into the screen, it will turn white, and then the principal on the left will cycle and highlight the new principal name. So it's not scroll jacking, it's completely connected to the user's scrolling intent, but it's really nice, and it's a nice little effect there. And we're going to build that next. So as a little refresher, the content model for this sticky content block is pretty simple. All it is just an array field called sections, and there's a label and a description. Label, description. That's it. We've decided that it should always be red because it's so closely connected to the color, to the meaning of the company. So there is no background color for this component. You could add one if you wanted to, but right now we're just going to map over the sections and output the right markup and the right CSS, and we should get to where we need to go. So if I go to the component, the first thing we have to do, again, is import our useIntersect. This hook, as you can see now, is becoming very useful for us, and it's paying dividends in the background in terms of performance, because if we didn't have Intersection Observer, we would have much less of a performant website. Good thing we do. Anyway, so we have a couple things here. We're using the scroll info package that we've talked about before. We're using intersect as the hook. We're setting the active index of which item in our array is currently active. And then we're setting the position of the actual sticky component itself. Then we're creating a quick viewport variable that's based off of the intersection observer. So there's not a whole lot of logic in this component. It's simple in that way. We've offloaded most of that to the actual useIntersect hook, but what we're saying here is if we're in the viewport and we have a ref to the wrapper, then get the bounding client rectangle and store the position of the actual sticky bar, whatever we want to call that. So again, if we're in the viewport, only render it when we need to, or only perform this logic when we need to. This second if is basically just making sure that React has given us a ref to the div below. So don't worry about that one too much. Mostly it's just this one as a performance optimization. But we're saying, yep, every time we render, let's set the position, the top and the bottom, from the bounding client rectangle. And this is built into browsers. It's not very performant. I wish there was a better way to do this, but what it is just tells you where the div or the element is on the screen. And in this case, we're using top and bottom, which tells you how far away from the top and how far away from the bottom we are. And we're going to use those in a minute. So then we go out, we output our intersection ref to tell us when this is in the viewport or not. And then we have our sticky ref itself. The sticky ref does a different thing. The sticky ref is just, you'll see that in a second. So then we have the gutter. Just like we've done elsewhere, we're basically faking the background color by position absolute. So we're just placing this in the background. That's all. But the real magic happens here in this. Well, here's the first grid cell. This one is going to be responsible for the items on the left-hand side of the page that are supposed to cycle in and out. And then we have another cell below that that is responsible for rendering out the descriptions. But if we stick with this first cell right here real quick, this grid is responsible for mapping over the sections and outputting the label. And this entire cell is going to be translated up the label height. So for example, you can see calculate label height times the active index times -1, so it's actually flipped to the negative. And what that's going to do is if we go over to our mockup, and I zoom out and I go to one of these, so you can see we have 3 of these guys right here. It's going to basically move it up or down depending on which index is active. So if it's the first one, it's not going to move at all. If it's the second one, it's going to move up like that. If it's the third one, it's going to move up like that. So we're just using a transform in a clever way. And the label height actually comes from, let's see. It comes from here. It's defined in the CSS. Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that that is consistent. They all need to have the same height for this to work. Otherwise, our math wouldn't work. It's kind of like a cheat. We could have like read the label heights themselves and kept an array of how tall each label is and then rendered that out. But in this case, it's much easier just to constrict the height and make sure that you always know how high the label is. So we're just calculating that and offsetting it with that label height. Then we render through the sections. If the current index is equal to the active index, we give it an active label class. And that's going to let us do the opacity like 0.01 or 1 or whatever we need to do based on if it's active or inactive. And then we skip outside of this grid container and we have another grid container. And the reason is, well, first we have a gradient to cover up the actual labels. It's a very subtle look, but you can see in this mock-up here that there should be a gradient above and below the sticky slider to make sure that you're really placing emphasis on the middle one and to give it that kind of a Rolodex kind of feel and look. But then we have a completely separate grid container. And the reason that this is separate is because this whole thing needs to be sticky, but this one doesn't need to be sticky at all. This one's just scrolling content right on the page. So we basically have 3 different position layers in this component. We have the background, which is the first Z index. Then we have the principal name, which is the second. And then we have this, which scrolls in front of all of the other components as the third. And the background color and the principals on the left are positioned sticky through the same top level component, whereas these ones just scroll naturally. So it's basically a bunch of things working in concert to fake that, that look that we're going for. Now, the last tricky part about this is actually toggling the description that should switch from light to dark color when it actually enters and exits the appropriate area of the screen. And remember that we have a lot of different things already stored in state. We have the position of the actual sticky component, the top and the bottom, and we have the Y position, the scroll Y position, and we have which element is active, and we have is in viewport. So with all of these different props, we can make some pretty good decisions inside of a separate component. So we call this the description component. This one here is going to have a ref to itself. If it is in the viewport and we have the ref, then get the bounding client rectangle. And we're going to basically use the center of this description to determine if it is inside or outside of the red background. So we say get the top plus the height divided by 2, and that's going to give you the center point vertically inside of each description component. And then we can say, hey, if the center position is greater than the root top and the center position is less than the root bottom, then we know that this one is active. And then all we do is just render out different styles based on if it's active or not. But each one of these descriptions has to have a ref to itself. And we have to calculate on the center because it's possible that multiple could be in the same box at once, and we don't want that. We only want one to be colored white at a time. So we're using that center point to do that. All right. I think that's going to do it for the layout blocks that we're actually going to go through and build in this series on YouTube. The rest of them that we skipped over, like the CTA grid, media collage, content collage, media grid, stat collage, those are basically more of the same that you've already seen. So if you're interested in any of those and you want us to talk through anything in specific, then let us know in the GitHub discussions and we will do our best to cover them. But other than that, all of these blocks are also used one for one to create the content for the study templates as well. So they're very reusable in that way. You could turn some of these off if you wanted. You could add other ones specifically for studies if you wanted. There's a lot of potential there, but I think we've done justice to these layout blocks. And by now, we have a fully functional website that you can scroll through and you can see how all those different layout blocks work in unison with each other. And you can see how it puts a significant amount of control into the admin's hands because this website is very much not static. It could be changed, updated, new things could be added very, very far into the future. So we have a couple more things to go through yet. I'd like to cover the form submissions, and then we're going to briefly touch on some nice-to-haves like the background noise and a couple other things. But next up, let's talk about the contact page and the form submissions. So the contact page, if I click over there, we've basically got like a little editable draft here, like my name is James and I building stuff with Payload. Want to work together? Later. And then you have an email field down here. This template is pretty simple. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to just look at this page template in NextJS. This is not a one-off page template. It's not a page that exists in the CMS, excuse me. There are no layout building blocks on this page because of the high level of functionality. Instead, what we've got is a hard-coded page template inside of the NextJS pages folder for contact. Because the whole layout is just so much different here and it doesn't really share any overlap with anything else. If we wanted to, we could add a layout builder into this page and revise the way that we've done this a little bit, but I don't think that we need to because this is all that we really need to do at this time. So here's the contact page. We've got props, just sending it the footer in the social media. We've got the initial state of the form, so the value. There's the initial message. It comes from the component folder, contact message. And we've got the component itself. Now, this component has a callback defined at the very top that's going to be responsible for when someone actually successfully submits the form. So we're going to make a fetch to Payload. We're going to send that fetch to /API/form submissions. And this fetch is going to be a post request with these headers, just content type application JSON to let us know that we're sending JSON through the body. And then we're going to stringify the data from the form, and we're going to add the source that says website contact page, just so if we want to add other sources in the future, we can do that. If I go over to the collection really quickly, let's take a quick refresher. Form submission is a collection on the payload side, and it stores email, it stores a message, and it stores the source, where the message came from. So if we have other forms in the future and we want to reuse this, we can do that. But these three things are all we need. Oh, you know what? Let's open up access control so that anyone can write to this from the front end. So let's say access create true. Now, anyone can create a form submission. You don't need to be logged into Payload to create them. You do need to be logged in to read them or to update them or to delete them, but to create it, anybody can do it just by posting to that endpoint right there. You could secure that further if you'd like by kind of obscuring your backend to only accept locally created form submissions with maybe an API key or something like that. But this is going to be totally fine for this purpose. So if we get a 201 back, we're going to say submitted is true up here. Otherwise, we're going to use React Toastify, which is a nice little package, to provide the user with an error message, toast.error. React Toastify is what we use actually inside of Payload CMS itself. I would highly recommend it. It's very configurable. It's really easy to use API-wise, and it's just better than building your own notification system. For a while at Payload, we actually rolled our own notifications, but it was just so much better to use this. We quickly determined to swap everything out for that. So this is the actual action that happens when you submit the form. But before we can actually use that, we have to do a couple more things. So the head, the template, we've talked about those two things before. Grid container, you've got that under control by now. But for the template itself, we have a quick header that just says contact. Then we've got a grid with a cell. If the form has been submitted, we're going to show a thank you message. Otherwise, if it hasn't been submitted, we're going to render a new component called form. And then there's two child components that we've also got set up here called message and email. And these two fields are actually how the user will not only interact with the React form, but also write in their information, right? And then we have another cell for the sidebar, the contact information, and we just have stuff that reflects the mockup. So we have sections, and we have paragraphs inside with anchor links to the different information that we need. And that's really all that there is here. But obviously the more complex parts are going to rely on this section here, the form, the React form. So a couple thoughts there. Number one, because this is a tutorial, we didn't want to use an off-the-shelf form like React Hook form. We could have, but we decided to give you the code for how to actually build a form yourself. Because, for example, there are probably places in your career where you might need to do this. The form that we've built is actually very similar to the form that works internally inside of Payload's React admin panel. It's not overly complex, but there is a good amount of complexity in there. And so we're going to give this code out there, and you can read through it and look at it at your own speed. But let's start with the form. The form itself, if I command click into there, it takes a couple different props. It takes onSubmit, which is a function to run when the form is successfully submitted. It takes children to render inside of it. Initial state. The initial state is the shape of the data that the form should initialize with. It takes a method, so get post. It takes an action where the form should submit to. And then finally an optional class name. So the fields of the form itself are going to be stored inside of a reducer. And we initialize it with our initial state. But our reducer is pretty simple. It just says, hey, let's replace the whole state, return a new one, or return an empty object, or the action.state. So if somebody wanted to send a new state in, they could. Removing a field is done by this, just deleting the path inside of the field. And then the default action is to take the value, the valid, the error message, and the initial value, and add it to the state. So it's really simple. You can see the default, you're just sending in a new field info. Remove is removing a field, and then replacing the full state is right there. Back over here, outside of the field state itself, our form will maintain a modified state. So whenever someone types in the first input, the form will know, yes, I've been modified. It stores a processing state, which says I'm submitting actively, so hold your horses. And then it takes a submitted state that says, have I submitted yes or no? And then we set up the context, because the context will pass itself down to every component inside of the form. So if we have like a text field, that text field can ask up to the top level form for the things that it might need to send the value of its field to and from the form. And then we set this context ref up with the active fields, the active initial state. I'm going to close this up. We'll get back to that. We have a few handy functions. This is mostly unused in this project up till this point, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But getFields is going to be a method that's passed down through context to return all of the fields as they are now. getField will return one field at a time in case you ever need to use that. getData will return only the data of the fields. So reduce fields to values is a function that we've written to loop over the fields in state and just only send back their values. So this is going to be helpful. Fields will have a lot more information like the error message, the validity, the initial state, but data will have only the currently active values. And then validate form is going to be a function to actually call whenever you need to validate the form manually. So we set all of that up with this context. And then every time we get a new initial state, we re-instantiate the fields by replacing state with the initial state. Then we have a typical form tag, method, action, no validate because we're going to handle that ourselves. OnSubmit is going to be a React method, a React prop to be able to run a custom function when a form is submitted, and then an optional class name. So we have a bunch of providers in this form. And the reason is because with providers, you want to separate out your concerns so that if a component only cares about the processing state, then they can use the processing context only, and then they don't have to re-render every time a field updates, right? And then the submitted state, same thing. If your component only cares if it's been submitted or not, you don't need to know when every field changes every single time. So by sending this information down granularly, your components can subscribe only to what they care about and not what they don't. Now let's go back up to that submit. So here's the submit callback. Notice that this form takes an onSubmit, but what we're actually sending to our form is submit. We're not sending the onSubmit. A user could, a React developer could provide this form with an onSubmit, or it could just use the typical action method and data and send data on its own. So if I scroll up, you can see we have a callback. Every time the submit is called, we say submitted is true and processing is true. If we're processing, we're going to prevent the default action and we're going to stop propagation. So what this means is it's going to stop the form from bubbling up and it's going to prevent the default action. And then we're going to validate the form fields. So for each different field, we're going to call that validate form. And that is a function that we define down here, right here. And we're just going to loop over the values in the state. And if any of them return true for field.valid equals false, then we know that our form is not valid, right? So we're going to loop over those values. If any one of them returns true for this, then we know the form is not valid. If it's not valid, we're going to send an error. Please check your submission and try again. We're going to set processing to false, and we're going to return false. We're going to get out of this function. If the prop type of onSubmit is equal to a function, that means that they want to call this function themselves, your React developer using this form. And so we're just going to wait their function. And we're going to send it the data from the active fields. So that's back in our contact.tsx, we had an onSubmit. Handle submit, we have an argument called data. This is the actual data of the form at the time of submission because our form is passing that through their callback. And then after this is done, we just reset the state. So set submitted false, processing false, modified false. So there's the form. We also have a couple different fields inside of that form. First one is message. The message, we have an initial message. We have the year and the current time. We have a height for this message because if we look back at our mockup or our website, and I refresh it, it should be able to get taller, but we don't ever want it to be smaller than that first height. So we're going to set that height and state. And then our form has a hook for field types, just like Payload does. This is a very similar concept to when you write your own components inside of Payload. There's a use field type hook. And the things that you need to send this are the path, the name of the field, and then the validate function. And then this field type is going to send you back the value and a way to set the value. And so you can see here we have a text area. we have the value. We're going to be controlling this text area by passing it the value. And then on change, we're going to set the height in case it gets taller, and we're going to set the value into the form through the use field type hook. So I'm going to go over to the email component real quick as well. This is a very similar component to that message component. Here we have a use field type hook again with a new path and a new validate function. And then we're rendering an input. We're also rendering a button inside of this component with an arrow, because when you click on that button, it should submit the form. Obviously, I didn't have an email there, so it didn't let me submit, but let's go back over here. But when you submit this, it's going to set its value, and the button will work normally because the HTML form, when you hit enter, when you click on a submit button, it will submit the form. Now let's look at this use field type. So the use field type hook is a pretty nice thing. It only takes, like I said, a path and a validate function, and then it ties into the form through the form's context for you. And it pulls out these three methods. First, it gets the field. If there is a field, we're going to store that as the field exists if it's already there or not. We're going to say if it has an initial value or not. We're going to keep track of its internal value. So this hook will keep track of the field's value by itself. But something cool is that we're going to debounce that field so that only every, well, this is 120 milliseconds now. Every 120 milliseconds, the field's value will be sent up to the form, but the user will never feel that delay because we're keeping an internal value. So the form will only ever be updated once every 120 milliseconds, but the user will feel an immediate update because of the way that we're separating these two. This one is going to be what gets passed back to the user. This one's going to get passed to the form. So it'll be a highly performant form implementation. Valid is equal to if the field.valid equals Boolean, then it's going to be that. Otherwise, it's going to be true. Send field is only used inside of this hook, but what it does is it sets up the field to dispatch with the proper shape and the action. It's going to await the validation of the field's validate function to understand if the validation result is a string or if it's just a Boolean. If it is a string, that means that we have an error message, so we're going to tie that to the field to dispatch, and we're going to set valid equal to false. Otherwise, it's going to be set to true. And then we're going to dispatch that field. So here's the actual method that gets sent through the field hook to send a value up to the form. So the first thing, if the form is not modified, then we're going to set modified to true, and then we're going to set the internal value to that value. If the initial value changes, then we're going to set the internal value to the new initial value. If the debounced value is not undefined, or if the field does not exist, we're going to send this debounced value up to the field. And then finally, we're going to, every time we unmount, we're going to remove this field. You can see that we're returning a function out of this effect that's going to clean up after itself every time it unmounts. And then we send these options back. But the API for this hook is quite simple. If we go back to that component and we look at how we had it all broken down in action, all you need to do is just return the field type will take a value and a set value, and then you are responsible for calling that function, sending the value, and then supplying the value to your user. Pretty small footprint. There's a lot of setup there. You could easily use React Hook Form as well, but if you're ever interested in building your own custom components for Payload, you're going to have a similar pattern here, which is, again, why we decided to keep our form structure in place here. This one's going to be out of date by the time this video comes out from Payloads, because Payloads is always updating and receiving new features, but it's going to be the same API. So now if we go over to the front end and we write up a quick message, let's say this is a test. Bye. And then we say dev@payloadcms.com, and then we hit send. Bam, we got a thank you message. And if we go over to the CMS and we refresh, we have a new entry into our CMS that tracks the form submission itself. And so these are permanently stored. No one else can read these. Like if I pulled up an incognito window, no one will be able to read these unless you're logged into Payload. And you can do some more fancy stuff to extend this functionality in your own projects. Like, for example, something that we've done already in the production version of this website is we've added a hook, a payload hook for after change. Here we have sent an email with the content of the message. So they get email alerts, and Payload comes with an email delivery service. So it's pretty easy, it's pretty quick to send an email, but for the sake of brevity, we've kept that out of this tutorial. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you before we wrap everything up is that there's actually a very subtle noise technique in the background of this website. And you have to probably see it on your own screen, but there's a kind of permanently kind of fuzzy, almost TV static noise texture throughout the background. And it's done with a pretty interesting CSS tactic that I think you guys might like to hear about. And where we've done that is inside of the template. Remember, this component gets rendered by every single page inside of the NextJS folder. So if I go to slug, I can show you the top level component is template. And this template is responsible for rendering the footer, the content, and the noise component. So if I go into that noise component, it's a very simple component. Most of everything happens within a couple more components within it, but the noise is fixed in the background. It's just behind everything and it's fixed at all times, just running in the background. You would never even see it. But it renders absolute noise, which is another component. We just moved it out just to keep everything isolated. But here we have a CSS animation that moves the noise to different places every time or every step in the keyframe. So the noise itself has a background image, and that background image is just basically like a fuzzy like Photoshop noise texture. So if I show you that, maybe I can pull it up in here. You really can't even see it, but there's a little bit of noise in there over top of the checker pattern. And that noise is a static tiny little PNG, but it gets moved around at all times and it gets repeated throughout the background of the website. So absolute background position means that it's going to get tiled, but it's going to be centered. And that animation is going to move that little PNG constantly 1 second. So every second, it's going to change positions 10 times and create that little static effect. And so you'll be able to see this when I share the production version of this website, but it's kind of a fancy little effect, and it's not too hard to build, and it's very performant. But that's rendering in the background of the site at all times. All right, with that noise component, I think that wraps it up. I think that's just about everything we're going to cover. There are a few things that we didn't touch on, like some of those layout building blocks and like the studies archive and things like that that you can find in the code, but we didn't really go over. I think it's more of the same at this point, more of those same exact components being used over and over again. And I think that you have a pretty good understanding of the approach that it takes to build a custom website from scratch like this. And again, like I was mentioning in that first video, the principles and the architecture and like the infrastructure that we've used to build this website is applicable not only for small brochure websites, but massive enterprise websites as well, where the money and the fulfillment and the timelines can be very comfortable to create a career out of. And not only just knock out these small little websites once every 2 weeks for your clients that live next door to you, but actually build stuff that you're really proud of and work with clients that are impressive and care about good design and quality code. Like this website was just a brochure website, but in the future, we could very easily extend it 1,000 different ways with a full portal for customers to log in and access their files or their history or anything like that, or e-commerce or anything, because we have the pieces in place and the clean code base to do just that. So for me, this video wraps up this series. And from here, Payload is going to be releasing a bunch of shorter videos on topics that will help developers use Payload to its extent. Like, for example, fine-grained access control. Who can access what document, what they can do with these documents, etc. from a security perspective. But also just functionality-wise, we're going to be talking about hooks in depth, how to send emails, how to write your own email templates, how to build an e-commerce platform, how to build a subscription engine, how to build like a video game. There are going to be a lot of things that we're going to cover in the future, specifically revolving around Payload. So if you've liked what you've seen, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you have any questions, like I've mentioned, let us know in GitHub discussions, because we're really excited to hear from you. We've got a lot of really, really great feedback on both Payload and this video series, and we're definitely going to do our best to keep it going. And we really appreciate all of you. So thank you and good night.